Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of the Superhero Ethics Podcast. My name is Matthew Westfox. I'm one of your hosts. And joining this week is our friend Katy Valentine, who has been a longtime friend and colleague of mine. I actually met her because she was a TA of mine in grad school. And I'm really excited to have Katy on because Katy is a lover of a lot of these questions and topics. In particular, we're going to be focusing today on the Buffy the Vampire Slayer, that character, and in particular, the idea of apocalypticism in the Buffy story, which is something I know Katy really cares about. So, Katy, do you want to say hello and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. And Matthew, was I really your TA?
You were. Yep.
For what class?
That was for exegesis. Biblical
Oh my
exegesis.
goodness. I just remember hanging out. I'm not sure I recall that particularly. So I'm so glad that we became friends after the TA experience.
Well, I'm glad that way. I feel like I won't get graded on this conversation. So
not at all. So
all the better.
Yes. A lot more fun than that. So I am a biblical scholar, which means I study a lot of ancient texts. I study a lot of ancient apocalyptic texts. I've been watching Buffy. I want to say, I don't know what the year was, but they were in season 6, and I caught an episode or two and really liked it, and then started watching it from the beginning, or when at the time there was no DVR.
Right.
TiVos were brand new, so I kind of caught it when it was on, and then eventually got all of the DVDs. And I'm really proud that I've converted at least 3 people to this TV show, like explicitly.
Nice.
People I knew would like it. I sat them down, and I kind of carefully selected episodes for them to watch. So I'm not only a fan, I'm a proselytizer of the show.
I like it.
Yeah.
I've done the same with Buffy as well as a couple other shows. So that's great to hear. Well, good. I'm so glad that you're able to join us. And especially, we're going to be jumping deeper into that topic of the apocalypticism, especially, and the role it plays in Buffy and the role it plays in a number of sort of superhero and similar shows. I know I want to definitely touch on Avengers and how it comes up. But let's just start with what really drew you to Buffy? What do you love about the show, and especially Buffy as a hero?
I think what I love about the show is what Joss Whedon, the creator and one of the main writers in its early years, really tapped into in the late 90s and early 2000s, and he's very explicit about this, is that there's a hero who is a woman, not only a woman, but a teenage girl. And she can fight, she can be smart, yet she can also be a teenager all at the same time. And that's, of course, one of the conflicts of the show. Can she have a normal life or can she not? And he said he was really tired of watching horror movies where the young blonde girl ran up the stairs and got, eaten or killed or whatever it was, because she didn't have enough sense to go through the front door and away from danger. Yeah. So he created this superhero that did the exact opposite. I like the mythology. I like sort of the spiritualism of the show. I think it's interesting. Joss Whedon is, I've seen him proclaim before, I don't know if he still is, an atheist, yet he really draws on this rich tradition of mysticism and of sort of spiritual realities that are just behind the veil, very apocalyptic. And that all appealed to me as a young adult and now as a not young adult as well. And I'm still watching it.
I think that's great. And you tapped into a couple things that I think also echo why I've loved the show. First of all, I remember when I first got introduced to it, I still thought of myself as kind of a goth kid. And certainly I rejected a lot. Like to me, the image of the blonde cheerleader was certainly not the person I was normally going to think of as a hero. And I remember the show was actually a really good way of me challenging that own assumption of like, why am, the kind of ideas I had about the preppies and the cheerleaders. And Buffy definitely doesn't necessarily fit into that, especially not as much as she does in the movie, that was made before the show. But there is definitely that element. And I love the way you articulated that about the way the show kind of really challenges that idea of, the assumptions that are often made about the blonde popular girl. So I think that's great. And I also think you're right about the mysticism aspect. To me, one thing that Paul and I, my normal co-host, often talk about, one of the reasons we love these shows so much, is these extended universes and is the way that there is a lot of consistency. And I think what Joss did was so interesting in terms of, having a clearly understood mystical world behind the show that, season after season we learn more about. in ways that I think get into some really great deep issues.
Yeah, I agree. And in Buffy, there's a little something for everyone. If you like scholarship, there's sort of an element of scholarship. They're always researching. They're always in books. If you like Wicca and witchcraft, beginning in season 2, there's a little bit of that. If you sort of see yourself as the person who is drawn into all this and you would really rather be anywhere else,
right?
There's a little bit of that too, right? That we all have to do things we don't really want to do, right? Given the choice, would Buffy be the Slayer? Would she not? And that's kind of one of the central questions of the show.
Right. Well, and something I know we'll talk about is that the element to some extent that she doesn't get to make that choice.
Right.
Which I know is a theme that we sometimes hear in hero things, but in particular, like, have you seen Luke Cage? Are you up to date with that one?
I've seen about half of it.
Okay. Well, at least you know that then, that's, without spoiling anything for you or any of our audience who hasn't seen it, but certainly in that and a number of other more recent shows, there's a lot about the hero having to choose whether or not they are going to be a hero. And I think it's interesting to think of Buffy in that light, because in some ways Buffy doesn't really get to make that choice, at least not at first.
Yeah, I agree. She doesn't. And what the tension the show plays on is within her role as the hero or the heroine of the story, what are the choices that she makes?
Right. Exactly.
Right. And sometimes good, sometimes bad. And they show her growing as she moves into young adulthood. And also making just very human choices sometimes too. And so I'm assuming that if you're listening to this, you're somewhat a fan of the show. Spoiler ahead for the next minute.
Yeah, I should say a spoiler warning for this podcast. We're probably going to spoil everything having to do with Buffy the Vampire Slayer, possibly some parts about the TV show Angel. And certainly I know we'll be spoiling elements from Avengers, both of the 2 Avengers movies. So if you haven't seen any of those, hit pause. Go watch 80 hours of television and movies, and then come back and keep listening.
Or listen and watch it anyway, because the dialogue and everything is so good, you'll enjoy it anyway.
Exactly.
But like in the Buffy and Angel relationship, there's this element of they sleep together and then he turns into a monster. Right. But there's also the element of she's a teenage girl and she sleeps with a guy for the first time, and then he doesn't like her anymore.
Right.
So it works on sort of this mystical level of magic, but it also just works on that's a really sucky experience to live through for anyone.
I always thought one reason why I loved Buffy so much, and I'll say I didn't love Angel quite as much, is I thought Buffy did this great job of being highly melodramatic about, these demons and vampires and end of the world situations, but using it all kind of as a mirror for high school, and the melodrama that we feel in high school. And there's an extent to which I loved it because I could sort of feel like watching someone be totally stressed out about the vampires and totally stressed out about a boy asking her out, and seeing them kind of be her reacting to both as a teenager. That worked for me in a way that, watching the TV show Angel, a good show in a lot of ways, But it's sort of like, because it didn't have that element of the melodrama, I found it harder to get into.
Yeah, and the high school metaphor works so well for Buffy in the first 3 seasons, and then they do decently in college, but it loses a little bit of that campy poppy atmosphere that a high school can provide, right? And for those of us who were watching it post high school, it was a chance to sort of revisit some what ifs and to be really glad about the things I didn't have to walk through every day anymore too, all at the same time, and that made it really fun.
No, that's definitely true. That's definitely true. I mean, I'm reminded of, there's a wonderful line in one of the Harry Potter books. I think it's the 6th book, and I can't remember, but where Ron and Harry are trying to ask out girls to the dance, and Ron sort of makes the point that, he finds it funny, but also rather true that, they've faced down dragons and monsters, and asking a girl to a dance is probably the scariest thing they've had to do. And it just had it was something I loved about those books, and I think Buffy handles quite well as well. I want to talk more about Buffy specifically, but let's just check in on a couple of the other characters. I know Anya is one who you said you really love, particularly because of the kind of moral role she plays in the show.
Yeah, and thinking about superheroes and sort of ethics, Joss Whedon and the Buffy kind of crew and cast and writers, I think, do this really nice job with the character of Anya. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the show, Anya started life as a human in the Middle Ages, somewhere in Scandinavia, And then she became a vengeance demon as, around the age of 20, 25, something like that. And a vengeance demon is one that wreaks vengeance mostly for women who have been wronged in love. And so she does that for 1,000 years, and then she messes up a deal and she becomes human again. And so we have this really funny voice in the show of Anya, who is unfamiliar with sort of the nuances of 20th and 21st century culture. And so asks sort of like ridiculous questions about, I don't know, who Madonna is or, things like that. About pop culture. But then she also was a demon for so long that she makes really amoral statements from time to time that are really funny. And so she says what everyone thinks in their head, but won't say out loud. But yet she's still a really likable character.
Yeah, and I think you're really right there. And I a lot of people have said that Joss Whedon sometimes always writes the same characters, and to some extent I think that that's a problem, but to some extent I love it. And I think Anya's if you look at Anya in comparison with Jane from Firefly, I think there's a couple other examples where Joss often has this character who sort of is kind of the audience voice, but is also the person who is, I think you're right, saying things that sound funny, but also is getting both the characters and the audience to question the assumptions they're making. Like Buffy and Xander will say like, oh, well, we couldn't do this because of course it would be, even though we might save 100 people, it would be wrong to have to kill this person to do that. And Anya's the one to say, well, why? And I love that because I think that there's something, to me at least, I think there's something almost dangerous about when our moral thinking just assumes those things all the time, instead of asking, like, is that principle we're operating from really a good principle to start from?
Yeah, definitely. And for someone like me who's been working in nonprofits for so long, Anya is this extreme capitalist. She loves making money and dreaming up new ways to make money. And at some point, she suggests to Buffy, when Buffy's having money troubles, you should charge people for saving their lives.
Right.
And there's this kind of ethic that's adopted, like in nonprofit worlds, and I think in culture in general, that if you're in a helping profession, you shouldn't make money at it.
Right.
Right. You shouldn't be compensated for the ways that you help people. Right. Of course, Buffy says, I can't. It's a calling. Right. Not a job, not a profession. Right. But it does kind of, it's funny. It's just a one-off joke. But it kind of does probe at some of our deeper assumptions of what we can and can't charge money for.
Oh, yeah. I think, and the example you raise is a great one, because I've worked a long time in the similar not-for-profit worlds. And I know one of the problems we used to look at is the fact that most of the staff of those worlds comes from some degree of economic privilege. Not all by any means, but it is certainly harder to, in part because we have this assumption of that shouldn't be a way to make a lot of money. And there's some value to that assumption, but there's some problems. And I think you're right. That's they haven't gone into it yet, I will say, but I know one of the parts of the Luke Cage and Iron Fist story that will be, I think, developed in a later season is they literally become the heroes for hire. And I know there's some discussion in that, some in the show, but some also in the comic books and in later shows about why shouldn't superheroes charge money for the things they do. So I think I'm really glad you reminded me that Anya had kind of brought up that issue, because I definitely think we're starting to see it now in some of the superhero shows.
Anya is kind of like the Charles Barkley of the Buffy world, she'll just sort of say anything. And I'm kind of reminded that someone once said to Charles Barkley or about Charles Barkley, like, well, you're a role model for kids. You shouldn't say those kind of things. And he's like, whoa, who made me a role model for kids? Right. Actually, I'm a sports commentator and I'm funny.
Yeah.
And so kind of thrusting roles on people, and Anya voices that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, especially because, as you were started saying from the beginning, when Joss was making Buffy, now we still don't have anywhere near enough female superheroes, but we certainly have a lot more now than we did with Buffy. I think when Buffy first came out, there was probably a lot of pressure on her to be like the paragon, the perfect female superhero. And I really appreciate that she's not, that she doesn't, and that there are other characters, that, like you said, she does sleep with a guy while she's, still, not even, I think most of us would say that, that the idea that she should be married to someone before she sleeps with them or something like that is not a moral judgment many people would hold.
No.
but certainly even that, remember, even that plot line had a lot of people really angry because they said Buffy is a role model for young girls. So how dare you show that? And I know I really appreciated the fact. And on the flip side, other people got kind of angry at the idea that the first time she sleeps with a guy, he turns evil. Because is that a really anti-sex message? Or
Buffy does not have a lot of sex positivity, actually.
That's definitely true.
Yeah, when I stop and think about it, maybe they show a really sweet, I think, first sexual encounter for Willow and Oz.
Yep.
But it's in the face of Apocalypse.
Yep.
Right? And then Willow and Tara in later years. I think they do have a very sweet love story, and sex positive, and gay positive too.
Right. Yeah, and there I think, I mean, the way that the gay relationship is developed there is wonderful in a lot of ways. Although of course, there is such a trope of a gay character having to die.
Right.
We warned you about spoilers, and the fact that
we won't say which one.
Yeah, exactly. But exactly. So I think that's another important thing. And we're going to dive into the Apocalypse topic in a minute or two. But are there any other of the characters from the show you wanted to kind of touch on or talk about?
Very quickly, I was thinking earlier about the ethics of the villains in the show. Yep. So in every season, they call it the big bad that most of the season is working towards defeating at some point. And I think I really like all of them except for season 4. Season 4 is not very good to me. But I really love the mayor in season 3. And the mayor is this 100-year-old person who's extended his life through nefarious, magical means in order to become a demon that's going to take over the world in a gigantic sort of apocalyptic vision. But the mayor is very funny and he's very moralistic. So he's very tidy. He tells Faith at one point, no talking like that. I'm a family man.
Right.
Now who's going to kill your little friends? And so he's very moralistic, but very amoral, right? Very unethical, in the way he goes about things. And I think putting those two together is a wonderful way to talk about ethics in our world, by putting them in the voice of this person we're really supposed to dislike.
Right. Well, because I think it's a great way of reminding us that in the end, these things are very subjective, because I think I've talked in past podcasts about how, to me, a good villain has to really believe that he is the hero of they have to believe they are the hero of their own story. And I think the mayor, you're right, is a great example, because the mayor would probably say that he's not amoral in the slightest. He has a very rigid moral system and an ethical system that he follows. It's one that most of the rest of us, I think, would reject, but by his own moral standards, he's absolutely doing the things that he thinks are right. And I love stories like that, because I think it in the same kind of way as Anya, it helps us remember a bit, that we can't just take the morals that we hold for granted, that they are still subjective, even if they're ones that most of us agree with.
Yeah, they are subjective, and we see this played out certainly in our daily lives. I mean, I do things that, nothing as bad as becoming a superhero, a super demon and taking over the world, right? But in all of our daily lives, we have these kind of tensions, right? We have good and bad, within us all.
Sure.
And these moral tensions, and they change over time. And we certainly see this played out in politics and religion and lots of different ways in the world today. And so it's really fun to me to have a character like the mayor, like these other super villains in a world like Buffy, where we can project some of those fears and some of those ideals and some of those moral questions.
To be sure, and here's one that we could probably do an entire show on, but I wanted to make sure we mention at least briefly, is the character of Faith. Because Faith is one who I think is, in a lot of ways, I see a pairing of Faith and Spike, in that Faith is a fellow, Slayer. So like Buffy, she is sort of by definition a good person, a good guy, a hero. And yet she makes a lot of choices that are clearly not in line with Buffy's moral system, and I think we in the audience can find pretty morally problematic. On the flip side, you've got Spike, who is, the title of the show tells you that, like, we're supposed to slay vampires.
Right.
Vampires are the villains. And unlike Angel, he's not someone who has, until the very end, gotten his soul back. He is a vampire without a soul. And yet, in a lot of ways, he becomes not necessarily a good guy, but certainly a much more morally gray character than just the villain, and becomes, in some ways, certainly a hero and a friend and a lover to people in the show. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts there, but especially those two characters and how they kind of like play with that idea of the hero and the villain.
I kind of live for Spike, so thanks for bringing him up. It's like, and for those of you, if you're thinking about watching Buffy or Angel for the first time, if you make it through to season 5 of Angel, you'll be really rewarded with a lot of good, like, Spike show episodes. It's really, really great. Yeah, and I think, Spike is this sort of morally ambiguous character at the time when he starts to develop a conscience in the show, in season 5. I would say, right? And so that he's kind of soulless, but yet he starts to love Buffy, and we like him for that. And some of his actions toward her are very sweet. Others are very reprehensible.
Yep.
All at the same time, right? And he kind of embodies like a lot of people, the good and the bad, right? Making his own sort of ethical choices. And he's making ethical choices without the guidance of having a soul all at the same time, right?
And I love that because I admit I was a little frustrated by the whole like vampires don't have a soul thing, because I think that there's something problematic. Kind of what that echoed for me is, ages and ages ago, there was, today we still see mirrors of this, but not as blatant, at least I hope, except in some sectors to be sure. But, it used to be at the time of slavery, there were arguments that black people didn't have souls, or at least did not have the same kind of souls as humans, or things like that. And so anytime I hear an argument that says, well, this other thing doesn't have the same moral weight that humans do just by definition, and therefore can be killed, vampires are obviously the enemy, but it always kind of, I saw that as problematic. And I loved the way they used Spike to play with that, to sort of say, okay, well, even if he is this soulless vampire, is there still some good in him? Is there something maybe wrong about this idea of like a clear black and white, you have a soul and therefore you're good, or you don't have a soul and therefore you're bad?
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And one thing the show does in a kind of campy way, right, is they put a literal face on evil, right? So all the evil characters literally have like bumpy ridges in their eyebrows, or they look like demons. And I remember I was watching an episode, a long time ago now, and a friend knocked on my door and came in, and it was on. And she said, oh my gosh, what is this show? And they just have demons like out in public, like that's ridiculous. I was like, well, that's part of the point of the show, is that demons are in plain sight all the time, right? But then they make easy targets and they're easy to kill.
Right.
And part of the show very carefully never has Buffy kill an actual human being. And the time she comes close with Faith ends up not being killed, but is in a coma.
Right.
As a result, right? So they never make Buffy actually have to make that moral choice, or she makes the choice, but it doesn't, the follow through doesn't happen. And so, yeah, I think you're right. With Spike, they show that those moral choices can be a little more ambiguous, because actually it turns out that we come to really, really like this soulless character. And I really like what you brought up about how humans have tried to use the soul analogy to dehumanize other human beings.
Yep.
Throughout time. And one of my areas of research is, in fact, slavery in the ancient world. And when I was writing my dissertation on slavery in the ancient world, there were some days where I had to go do something very happy for myself, because it does get really hard when you see, the way that people are treated because they're thought of as less than human.
Oh,
right.
Sure.
So who's making those kind of ethical choices in the world, right? Yeah, who's getting to make those definitions? And I think the show doesn't wrestle with that question on a big meta level, but we do see it through some threads, like with Spike and with Faith, as a kind of a sub theme.
To be sure, and I'll just give a brief plug. I know on an earlier episode of the podcast called "Who Shall We Kill?" This was actually the topic we talked about, Paul and I, my normal guest host. Just because how often is it that like, if a movie wants us to know that the aliens are terrible, they will make them look ugly and terrible, so that we feel okay killing them, or it's okay. Like, I think there's always some interesting questions about what are the ways that superhero shows make us feel okay rooting for the hero to slaughter these other living things because they're aliens, or because I think the conclusion we came to is that the human who can most easily be killed is a Nazi, because Nazis are seen as so morally reprehensible for good reason. Like, Captain America killing Nazis is almost never going to be seen as morally problematic, because those are the people who are the easiest for us to justify, and same way with, in the Avengers movie, the aliens who invade they have that same kind of like crazy, scary look, like you said, from the demons in Buffy. So, yeah, I'm really glad you were talking about that, because I think there's something really important about the way we play with that idea of who can or can't be seen as morally worthwhile.
Yes, and for those of you who are kind of in the know, one of my favorite episodes in season 6 is Tabula Rasa, where everyone forgets they all have amnesia, and so Spike, when his head turns into Bumpy and he realizes he's a vampire, he says, "Oh, well, maybe I'm a good vampire. Maybe I'm a vampire with a soul dedicated to righting wrongs." And so he makes himself into Angel in his own imagination in a really, really funny way. Yep. And one thing I do appreciate especially about Buffy a little more so than Angel, is that they do laugh at themselves and their own sort of moral superiority. Yeah.
No, I think it's definitely true. I think the show does a great job of that. We've been dancing around this topic of apocalypse and apocalypticism, which I think is really central to the whole Buffy story, in terms of, Buffy is created because these people see a potential apocalypse. And what I mean that is a potential end of the world threat. And that's a word that I know gets tossed around a lot in pop culture, but it has some really important like historical and biblical roots that Katy, I know you've done a lot of research and a lot of thinking about, especially in terms of Buffy. So do you want to start by just telling us a little bit about what do we mean by apocalypticism, both in terms of the kind of original meaning of the word and how it's being used today?
Sure. Let me start with how we actually use it today. When we talk about apocalyptic books, movies, whatever the media is, usually what we mean today is that there's a threat, generally a global threat, to human life or to all of creation, like to the global world. And that apocalypse is to be stopped at all cost. And so that's certainly true in Buffy. It's true in the Avenger movies. It's true in lots of different books, right? So that big threat that could threaten to end the world as we know it has to be stopped. So it's always seen as a negative thing. But the ancient concept is actually a little bit different. So the word apocalypse literally means to remove the veil. And when we remove the veil, we see the spiritual realm that is just on the other side. Right? So an apocalypse usually is a vision or a dream or some kind of communicated text that a person sees and then writes down about the actual spiritual realities that are happening all around the person. Usually in the ancient world, of course, it was a man.
Right.
And so, so those become revealed, and that's how we get the name of the last book of the Bible, Revelation.
So that's the idea of that it's a person who is having an apocalypse vision.
Usually the apocalypse is communicated in the form of a vision or a dream.
Right.
And then written down later. So ancient Jews we have a lot of apocalypses from ancient Jewish writings and, of course, from ancient Christian writings as well. And so I do want to give listeners just a little tidbit, and I apologize in advance because this is now going to drive you all crazy for the rest of your lives. Because the final book in the Bible is one revelation. It's one apocalypse. It's one vision that the seer John has. But in movies and in TV shows and almost everywhere, I hear this out loud, they'll say, well, the book of Revelations. So they get that wrong. And so Hollywood, I'm just letting you know now that I'm available for hire so you can start to get this thing right. And the way I usually see TV shows refer to the book of Revelation is very shallow. They take a random verse out of the book, throw it on the screen, and say something terrible is about to happen and we have to stop it. And they really miss the deeper meaning of apocalypse, right. Which I'm happy to talk a little more about. Apocalypses usually in the ancient world arise from people who feel that they are being oppressed. They don't feel they're being oppressed. They are being oppressed, or they at least perceive themselves as being oppressed. And so they envision this apocalypse as a destructive event, as a world-ending event. But after the apocalypse is when justice is restored. So apocalypses are also means for the things that have been done that are wrong to people to be made right, for them to be redeemed, and for them to live in a new reality that is one where justice actually prevails.
And sort of to clarify somewhat, because this is fascinating to me, when you talk about that word, obviously it has come to have real meaning in the Jewish and in Christian worlds because of the religious significance. But is it a word that would have been used but by others in the Greek or Roman or other ancient worlds, not necessarily part of those religious communities?
So the word itself, we actually get from Revelation 1:1, the apocalypse or the revelation of John.
Mm-hmm.
So the word itself, was just a Greek word.
Okay.
So it would have been used as a genre. This is a genre that does cross other ancient writings. So we have Persian apocalypses. We have some Greek apocalypses. We do have a few not full-on apocalypses, but sort of apocalyptic light Latin writings as well. They are not as fully developed, at least the ones we have left, are not as fully developed as the Jewish and Christian ones, because for obvious reasons, those were of interest to Christians in Europe and Africa and the Middle East during the rise of Christianity. So they continue to be copied down.
Right.
So the other ones, we do have other apocalypses, but they're just not as well known. And the ones that we have left are a little more scattered.
Right.
So, but as a genre, other people were envisioning similar things that Christians and Jews adopted and then turned into their own genre.
Right. And I mean, as you said, because it's been Christians recording the history for so long, it's not surprising that that's now what we know most about. I do know, and I'll say at the beginning, I'm not an expert of this by any means, that people who know Norse religious mythology, or people who just know the Thor comic books really well, know that the upcoming movie Ragnarok, it's named that because there is a in the Norse pagan mythology, there is an understanding of what I guess you might think of as an apocalyptic event, Ragnarok, which is their understanding of sort of the end of the world, the destruction of the world. So certainly it's an idea that I know certainly some other religious traditions often have similar things, but I think it's really helpful for us to hear what are the very particular roots of this word that now has come so much into pop culture. So that's where I'd want you to go talk next a bit is what do you think is the significance of that shift in terms of the way we see the word now?
The shift is interesting to me because the way that we use it today, there's not often a lot of room for redemption. Right. For the hopefulness. The hopefulness is in stopping the apocalypse, not in letting it occur. Right. So there's never this sort of radical undermining of sort of the reality or the world as we know it. Whereas the ancient Jews and Christians, who at the time were very, very small minority populations, right, in the ancient world, they were laughed at, they were made fun of. They really envisioned a future where not that they would be sort of rulers of the world. You're not trying to turn the tables. You're trying to right the wrongs.
Right.
Right. So when Buffy stops the apocalypse, they're never righting wrongs.
Right. It's always about just preventing things from getting worse.
Preventing things from getting worse, continuing as things are. I would say with the exception of Angel, like season 4, when I've forgotten her name now, where the woman who was also in Firefly.
Oh, I know the person.
About the big bad, right? She actually does create a utopia paradise on Earth, but it's because it's not people's free will, right? It's not their choice, and so that is where a new reality of sort of pseudo justice is created. But they believe that the cost of human choice is too high, and so they reverse it. Well,
and it's interesting, and I'm a little freeballing here, so maybe I'm missing something. But as I'm thinking about it, there are certainly superhero stories I can think of that might fit more into that older version of the word apocalypse. The Matrix is the one that first comes to mind, but also Star Wars to some extent, where the heroes aren't trying to defend the current world from something much worse happening. They're trying to completely subvert the order of the world as it is to replace it with something new, to destroy the Empire in Star Wars and bring in a new era of justice. Or in Matrix even, it goes even deeper since in the movie The Matrix, or the trilogy The Matrix, you really have an entire reality that's being defined by the machines, and our heroes are trying to basically completely destroy that so that a new world can be built.
Yeah, I think so. And those are good examples of apocalyptic or sort of post-apocalyptic that do draw on this thread of hope.
Right.
that Apocalypse can represent. But what is very interesting as a genre, I think the piece about hope is often missing, but not always in some of these worlds that we're talking about. But there's common features of apocalypses that actually do translate, and I think very unknowingly. I doubt that. I don't know for sure. Joss Whedon is a really smart man, and I'm a fan. So maybe he has, read these books about like theories of apocalypse in the ancient world. But I think it's more so that the genre has taken root into human imagination, especially in the West. And we do this unconsciously, right? We can reproduce sort of the features of apocalypticism without knowing that we're doing it. And so it replicates itself. So like, there's a list of like 13 attributes of apocalyptic writing, right? And scholars will take ancient texts and measure, do they have 7 or 8 or 13 of these? But a few of them, I think, actually are relevant to pop culture, to what we talk about today. So one of those is a hero takes a journey and is guided by an otherworldly being to show him or her sort of the vision that we're talking about.
Right.
Well, in the case of Buffy, she does have these otherworldly guides. She has dreams and visions. The first Slayer serves as a guide for her. She has a dream where Faith serves as a guide for her. And I would say Giles, he's not an otherworldly being, but he is this figure that has access to the world that she doesn't know.
Well, and I think that
guides her.
I think there's something really interesting there, especially because, when I first think about it, I think that for the most part, Buffy is a story about just stopping, defending the status quo and stopping things from getting actively worse. But there is a way in which the Buffy story is also kind of a subverting of the order, especially at the very end, because, and I think we should get into this in a little bit specifically, but like, one of the most problematic parts for Buffy about the whole situation is that she's been created by this council of men who are telling, all of the Slayers what to do. And so the kind of the order of the world is such that, the woman hero has to save the world according to the way that the men tell them to. And that there can only be one Slayer at a time. And the sort of great, end event of the last episode of the last season is Buffy subverting that and is, releasing the power with Willow's help and with everyone's help so that they can all be Slayers. And so I'm wondering how would that fit in? Because there seems an element of, even though for the most part it is that kind of stop an apocalypse, not let the bad thing happen, there is a real fundamental like breaking of the structure of the world of Slayers and changing it into a more hopeful thing, a more just thing.
Yes, thank you. And I agree completely. And one of the reasons I really appreciate this show and the way that it uses the apocalyptic genre is because it does it smartly. And it's not shallow.
Right.
In the way that it conceives of apocalypse, unlike many, many, many TV shows that I see on that reference apocalyptic thinking and vocabulary. So I think Buffy at the very end, they do remake the world. And throughout this series, she is doing things on her own terms, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. And so that's the part of the genre sort of flipping that Joss Whedon does very well and that I appreciate. And I think that starts midway through season 3 when she tells the council she's not going to work for them anymore.
Right.
Right. And so then she's rogue. She doesn't have a watcher anymore. Right. So she does, as a young woman, starts to make her own choices, define her own reality, make her own plans, with the consultation of others, but ultimately making her own choices. Yeah. And I think at the end, it is hopeful. And I know a lot of fans were not crazy about the ending. I actually rather liked it. And at the very end, you see what was Sunnydale as a big hole in the ground, and you see just the glimmer of a smile on her face, knowing that the future could be better.
Right. No, and I think that's a great point. Because of that idea of hope, and also because of that idea of, like I said, I think one of the hardest parts of her story is the idea that she's supposed to be this hero on other people's terms. And so that she's fighting not only the evil she's supposed to be fighting, but also the way she's supposed to be fighting it, in terms of like someone else doing it. Especially because, and I think this is a great way to get into this specifically, one of the things that she's asked to do and literally does in season 5 is to constantly sacrifice herself, for the good of everyone else. And I think that's something we see a lot in apocalypticism, especially the modern idea of apocalypticism, where it's the world is going to end, we have to do something. So what's your take on this idea of self-sacrifice and like the way that apocalypse kind of is used as a plot device to justify this person has to sacrifice themselves?
Yeah, I think that's a constant theme of the show. I think it's a constant theme of our culture as well, and that the show kind of reflects that. So Buffy is the chosen one. She's the only Slayer in the whole world, like we said, until the last 10 minutes of the series finale. And so she is constantly called on to make the choices. To make the choices, the hard choices about who lives, who dies, when is that. And she's in her own sort of personal self-sacrifice as well. And so within the show, she does self-sacrifice, and at the end of season 5, giving the kind of ultimate self-sacrifice that she can, which is her life, which is referenced. It's foreshadowed definitely through the 2 seasons before then in a very kind of apocalyptic way, right? Giving these signs and portents and futures and prophecies. And so Buffy, in the end, she solves this problem, as we said, by creating a world of Slayers.
Right.
Right, where the burden is not all on here. But this kind of ethical question of what is enough and what is not enough and when do we get personal lives is, I think, very prevalent. We expect politicians to sacrifice their personal lives, right, for the common good, right? We expect them to lay bare everything about their past for the common good so that we can know that. We certainly expect everyone in nonprofit worlds to do that, right? To sacrifice their time, sacrifice their own well-being, at times their health, right? For the good of the people they're helping. Well, the problem with that is, and this is something we all know, there's always more to do.
Right.
There's always something else we can be doing, right? Whatever we're doing is never going to be enough to save the world.
I mean, especially in the most recent Avengers movies and now the Captain America movie, I've often sort of wished someone would sort of grab Tony Stark and say, listen, why don't you take some time and go see a therapist about the PTSD you're dealing with?
Right.
And, like in the not-for-profit world, at least, there is some element of like reminding people, self-care. Take some time for self-care. We don't give superheroes ever that opportunity. No one ever goes up to Bruce Wayne and says, listen, like, how about you process your feelings about the death of your parents a little bit?
Yeah.
Not like,
right.
But in part because there's always the Joker. There's always there's always some new scheme that's happening. And I think, it's interesting how often this idea of sacrifice is expected of our heroes, sometimes quite literally, the heroes who expect, who need to die for someone else, sometimes more metaphorically when it's the hero who has to give up potential love or a family, or, they have to give up the life they would want for the help of others.
And in the case of the Avengers, they have Hawkeye is the one character who does step away, right, for like sake of personal time and family, and he is the most boring character to me.
Yeah, I can see that.
I mean, right? Like, I'm not compelled by him, and so it's kind of a compelling ethical question, right? This kind of theme of sacrifice. But I would like to see Thor and Loki get some like family systems therapy, right?
Now, that
work out their problems.
Maybe even bring Odin into it, because I think some of the fatherhood there could be helpful. No, but I think you make a great point, especially even with Hawkeye. Spoilers now for Marvel's Civil War. He is dragged into the Civil War, and it's interesting. I think he makes a joke or two about how, I thought the characters kind of joke at him like, weren't you retired? And he's like, yeah, I wish I was retired, but at one point someone asks him, what are you doing here? And his response is disappointing my daughter. And I think it is funny in the moment, but it's also sad, and it's very telling, because what underlies that joke is, well, he could retire if everything was fine, but because there was another potential problem, not even, I think, an apocalypse in Civil War, just another potential problem, of course he can't retire. Of course he has to, strap on the bow and arrow and come back into the fight. And I think that's something we see a lot with these superheroes in normal situations, or in bad situations, but especially in the situations that are thought of as apocalyptic, as the world's going to end.
Yeah, and do we do this together, or do we do it alone? The superhero myth right? The superhero complex, literally, is that it has to be done alone. Right. And one reason I really appreciate the ending of Buffy is because I think the answer to that question at the very end is it actually takes a village. And that's a model that I try to live with in my personal life, where I don't always succeed. Sometimes I do get superhero complexes too. Most of us do. But, at the end with Buffy, I think it's, we can all share this burden together.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a great point, especially because even with some of these team up movies, it's now there's always the character, in Avengers, in Civil War, and all. There's always the character who's like, I can do this completely alone. And eventually he or she might realize, they need a couple of friends. But there's still that idea of, we small band of heroes can still do everything. Buffy's – I'm trying to think of others where it really is about that idea of literally empowering, huge numbers of people to do the work instead of just a small group. I can't think of any offhand. I'm sure there are probably others, but I think Buffy is definitely one of the best examples of that.
Yeah, and it doesn't make for quite as compelling storyline, right? We really, really just human beings. We really like the single hero or
right.
small band of scrappy heroes together who are a little unusual, coming forward and saving the day. And I'm one of them. I'm one of them. I don't necessarily think it's the healthiest model for self-actualization. Among us as regular human beings who are not superheroes, but it makes for really good storytelling.
Oh, to be sure, and I think that's often one of the tensions we're always going to deal with in this kind of we're bringing deep philosophical analysis to what is in the end entertainment, and I love it, and I am very entertained by it, and I think they do some great messaging, but I think that's an important tension of. On the one hand, the individual makes the better story, and a TV show about a team of 1,000 people is going to be impossible to do because you're never going to get to know any of those people enough to really care about them. But at the same time, I think as we're doing, it's important to think about what are the kind of problematic messages that can lead us to. Go ahead.
Oh no! There's a really sweet moment in season 7 where. Dawn thinks she might be one of the potential slayers, and I am so not a Dawn fan. Every episode that's about her, I kind of want to run screaming from the room.
I'm with you there.
Oh yeah. So, but anyway, but this one episode is sweet, despite her being kind of one of the central features of the particular episode. But in the end, she has to make as a regular human being, even though she started life as a ball of energy or whatever. In the end, she realizes she really has to take a step back. She's not one of the potential slayers, and she fulfills her role sort of as the supporting researcher or whatever it is. And Xander sees her and goes up to her and tells her what a hero he thinks she is.
Right.
In the end. And I find that moment very sweet, very compelling. And so this show does manage to find small ways to lift up, those people who are not superheroes. And that might be continued further in the comics, which I haven't really pursued as much as well.
No, I think you're right. And I think that's another, it's another really good thing and the Avengers do that somewhat in that, you have these people with incredible powers or incredible technology. And then you have Hawkeye and Black Widow who don't really have any powers. They just have incredible training, but they're still just as vital to the team. And I think and even, particularly the Captain America, Winter Soldier movie. They did a great job of, having Captain America specifically reach out to the people, still within S.H.I.E.L.D. who are fighting Hydra and calling on them to, that each of them could do their part. And there's that wonderful scene where, I forget the character's name, but he's played by the guy who plays Abed in Community. And he's really just he's really just kind of like a desk. He's one of 100 technicians in a room. That helps to operate the S.H.I.E.L.D., technology that Hydra's trying to take over. And he spends a minute, standing up to the bad guy and saying, no, I'm not going to let you do this. And if I remember, it's not very effectual in the end, but still it's sort of a wonderful illustration of how that can help. And him doing that helps to inspire others. And so I think, there's something great there about how the people with powers make the best stories in some way, or at least, the TV often shows us that they do, but there can be some great stories and some great heroism shown by all people.
One of my favorite moments in Harry Potter, in the book and in the movie, is in the first movie. At the very end of the movie, Neville stands up and tries to stop Harry and Hermione and Ron from moving forward to go face, whatever it is that they're going to at that particular moment in time, and then they zap him and they freeze him, and he kind of falls over so he can't move.
Yep.
But he ends up winning. He ends up for their house getting the most points because he's awarded like 1,000 points for his bravery and standing up to his friends.
Right. No,
Very end, and it just like every time I watch that, my heart just melts a little with like love for Neville, and yeah. So we find ways to bring this in.
It's a wonderful moment to be sure. Well, and another thing I want to ask about, kind of pulling us back a bit to the apocalypticism thing, is so in our modern idea of apocalypse means the end of the world, which certainly is a big part of Buffy. Almost every season, I think every season it seems like there's a potential end of the world.
Yeah,
one of the things that's often used to justify, I think one of the interesting questions that Buffy and the rest of the team often faces is, okay, we have these things that we think are right and good, the things that an Anya character would question, but we just know in our hearts these are right. But now the end of the world might happen, and so do we still want to hold on to our moral principles, even if I'd love to hear you talk about sort of what happens with apocalypticism when characters are facing an apocalypse and now having to question what are we willing to do? Like, as you said, are we willing to pay any price, including making moral choices we might normally be okay with, to stop an apocalypse?
Yeah, I think this, again, is a central sort of point of the show, and I think of apocalyptic genre in general. So the end of the world is coming. So the real question is, who can we kill in order to stop it?
Right.
Right. And is that justifiable or not? Almost always the answer is that it is justifiable. And usually the person in command, superhero, whoever it is in this, in these apocalyptic superhero genres, is the one who makes that call. Buffy gives a very sort of impassioned speech she gives a lot of speeches in the show, but in season 7, in the episode Selfless, where Anya, she thinks she's going to have to kill Anya, who's become a demon again.
Right.
She gives a really impassioned speech to Xander, who's of course opposing this choice, about how it always comes down to her. She always has to make the hard choices. She recognizes that it's a little bit of a morally gray area for her. But in the end, she does choose to kill her. She ends up not. But that's not because she made the choice not to. It's just because it happened in a different way.
Right.
So, yeah, I think apocalypses have the potential to bring out the very best, but also the very worst in humanity, right?
Mm-hmm. No.
And so, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I think you're completely right there. And I think that's, as you were just saying that, I remember that moment, and I think it's a powerful one. But in part because I think it reminds me of, as problematic as the Watcher Council was, and we both celebrate Buffy breaking free of that Watcher Council, at the same moment, a moment like that is what reminds you that now Buffy has no accountability to anyone except herself, right, and what she thinks is right. And that in theory, the point of the Watcher Council is for her to have someone she can go to say should I kill Anya in this situation or should I not? Because maybe I need someone who's not so personally invested in it. And the Watcher Council obviously was terrible for that. But I think what Buffy really, and she admits that the terrible situation she's placed in is she doesn't have that. So she now has to make this horrible choice of, balancing one life against others and a life that she knows versus, the others who she may not connect with and things like that.
Definitely. And this show makes a particular point to never have Buffy kill another human being, right? She kills things that are pretending to be human, like vampires and demons,
right,
other things like that. And so they're very sort of carefully conscript the show so that we never have to watch her actually kill another human being. However, other characters in the show do, and I do think that they deal with those consequences. They give them this show gives them the weight that they deserve. There's actual psychological ramifications to killing another human being, and when there's a character who doesn't show remorse, we're supposed to expect intervention,
right,
on behalf of that character. So in sort of framing an apocalyptic this show manages to get through without killing actual humans, but they kill a ton of things that look like humans, right? That they've given the name of evil. So the danger, of course, for us today is that we, as we were talking about earlier, can dehumanize other people in the name of something that feels apocalyptic to us.
Oh, to be sure. I mean, and
yeah,
I'm thinking especially like once we've seen what happens to Spike, that he does still do horribly terrible things, including to Buffy, towards the end of their relationship to each other. They don't want to, that I'm not going to spoil, but it's a very important plot point. But I think it's interesting because, so we see in the character of Spike that there is in this world at least a potential for, a vampire to not necessarily just be completely, by definition, the worst thing possible. But yet, one of the things that Buffy does is kill vampires like the moment they're popping out of the grave.
Yeah.
Before, and you almost kind of wonder, like, now that Buffy has met Spike, the show doesn't go into this, and I can understand why, because it doesn't want to, question its first 4 seasons of existence. But would there be a part of her that would start to say, I was killing vampires before they even really realized they were vampires because I just knew a vampire is evil and wrong and bad because that's what I was taught. But is that problematic thinking? Do I need to question that somewhat? Should I have been just like, waiting in the grave for the vampire to pop out so I could kill him the moment he did or she did?
Yeah, so we really need like a school for vampire redemption,
For sure.
Like, so they can, right, yeah, so they can come in and learn how to make their own moral choices. And yes, I think Spike is a good example of that, and Anya is too, to some extent, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I mean, I really love the message, within those 2 characters that people are redeemable.
Right.
Yeah, people are redeemable. We do things that are unforgivable, but we're still able to come through sometimes.
No, to be sure, and I think that's I think that's to me one of the most problematic things of the apocalypse ideas is that we'll often be able to think like, okay, this person, we need to stop their evil plans, but let's not try to kill them because maybe they can be redeemed. But once you say there's an apocalypse, then it's easier to start saying, we don't have time to try to save this person's soul. We have to just kill them before they can push the red button. We don't have time to try and appeal to this person's morality so that they don't do this terrible thing. We're so close to the end of the world. And I've never personally been faced with an apocalypse, so I can't say how I would think in those kind of ways. And I think that there isn't, I try not to have utilitarianism be what guides my ethics, but on some level, like ending one life to save 5 billion, that's a moral calculus I can probably get behind.
Right.
But I think that the problem when so many of our stories are so apocalyptical in that way is that it means that we're always acting as though everything is an end of the world situation.
Right. Everything's an emergency all the time. And often in our, apart from the story world, in our daily world, we sometimes see apocalypses where they're not there.
Oh yeah. Well, and
right?
Here's where I to go back to what we were saying before. This is where I love the idea of high school as the metaphor for everything else, because I think, I remember being in high school and one person didn't laugh at my joke and it felt like the end of, like I was going to become a little bit lower on a social ladder for 10 minutes one day. To the high school mind, that can feel like the end of the world.
Right. Yeah. And it's sometimes hard to see beyond your immediate future.
Right.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I resonate and I remember as well.
Well, go ahead.
Well, and kind of thinking about let me draw out just very briefly one of the critical differences between ancient apocalypse and apocalypse today, the way we talk about it.
Go for it.
The ancient apocalypses from which we're talking about, that we've been drawing for this genre, ancient Jewish and Christian apocalypses, are produced by tiny minority people, mostly in the Roman Empire and some other empires as well, who see themselves as the eventual victors and people who will be restored to justice. Today, so they're a very minority group. Today, the perpetrators of the apocalyptic kind of myth, especially in a sort of a global political world, are in the majority.
Mm.
So when a majority population promotes apocalyptic thinking, it has a very, very different end result.
Oh, yes.
And becomes much, much more dangerous, and can be much more insidious. And so there's been quite a bit of scholarship that has been done about American politics in the 80s under Reagan. Reagan himself was not particularly apocalyptic or, uber religious. But Nancy, of course, was very into spiritualism and made people really nervous in Washington. So Reagan surrounded himself partly, I think, to kind of counteract Nancy's sort of spiritual leanings that made people uncomfortable. But he really surrounded himself in his cabinet with very apocalyptic Christians.
Right.
And that very much influenced, for instance, if they think the world is about to end, that influences the way you think about the environment. You're like, well, there's no need to try to save it.
Right. Well, and if you see
Yeah.
the Soviet Union as an apocalyptic existential threat, you're a lot more willing to say, like, well, let's jack up the nuclear program because that need is so much stronger.
Yes. And, this is the kind of thing in my professional life I help people think through. I see on Facebook just all the time, oh, look, the signs, they're here. I don't try to take it down on Facebook, but, privately, individually, if you're having concerns about apocalyptic signs from the Bible, please reach out to me. I can help you think through what that might be and kind of, find different ways to approach it. It is really not helpful in our daily lives to approach the world as apocalyptic.
Well, no, and it's true.
Yep.
And I think that there's in some of the mental health work that I've done, we often talk about this term catastrophizing, which is where, and I see this in mental health. I also see it when I'm a poker player, and you have one draw that goes badly against you. It's easy to start thinking like they always go bad against me. I always remember that. And I can see that on a personal level, but also I think that I hadn't heard that point before, but I think you're so right. When the story of the apocalypse is now being told by a group that is already in power, now we're definitely into the realm of the apocalypse is supposed to is the thing that's going to attack the status quo. There's never a thought about apocalypse could be good, could be changing things. But it also makes you realize that if there is a potential apocalypse, keeping the people in power, if they're what's keeping you safe, that's a great reason to keep them in power. And I think both in fiction, like in 1984, but also in our real world, we're seeing examples, like you said, with Reagan, but also continuing, the way that first communism and now terrorism or immigrants or gays are all being used as this kind of like, this is the apocalyptic threat. This is the threat to America. This is the threat to the world. And so therefore we have to do these terrible things. It's really kind of scary seeing how that kind of thinking is continuing to be replicated.
It does. And the danger, which I think we pointed out, is that those people then become ones, who are less than human, right? They're
Right.
without souls and therefore expendable.
Right, to be sure. I mean, and I'll even say, like, I said in a recent podcast that I obviously have my own biases, but I would even say that I've seen it some on the other side. Like, I'm by no means whatever my own thoughts on a potential Trump presidency might be. I do see sometimes where I see people talking about, like, well, we can't let Trump be president, and so anything and everything to do to stop that is okay.
Right.
Even there,
Yeah.
I'm starting to think, like, is that personally, I think a Trump presidency could be a pretty horrible thing. But when it becomes that level of apocalyptic thought that justifies any and everything, even there is when it makes me sort of stop and question and be like, wait a minute, how much are we kind of going to that well too easily?
Yeah, definitely. And apocalypticism is not reserved for any one sort of particular religious political spectrum.
Right.
Right. Yeah. It can manifest in lots of different ways, and on all ends and every point in between on that spectrum.
Well, and this is where, and I think it's interesting that Joss Whedon also told this story. I wonder if you think this is true. Whether or not it's intentional, Avengers 2: Age of Ultron, which is a movie that I've often been very critical of, but I think in this it's brilliant, makes a very interesting point about apocalypticism. Because what you basically have in that movie is Tony Stark has had a revelation. He's seen the alien army and he's terrified of it. And now his fear of a potential apocalypse down the road is so strong that in an attempt to stop potential apocalypses, he creates Ultron, which leads to a very real potential apocalypse that is only barely averted.
Right.
And I think there's something really interesting there about the character who is so afraid of the apocalypse that he almost, in an attempt to stop it, almost creates it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And in the ancient concept of apocalypses, they're always avertible if people, not always, I'm really drawing over the broad swath here, but they are avertible if humans can act the way that they're supposed to act.
Right.
Right. If humans can enact justice themselves, there is no need for an apocalypse, right? The apocalypse has only come because gross misconduct, gross injustices are being done.
So this idea of gross misconduct to stop it wouldn't really even be a part of that kind of thinking.
In my particular way of thinking about apocalypses as we translate them today, no.
Right.
And really, it's not like I've read every apocalypse of the ancient world, but in the ones that I'm kind of familiar with, it does seem to be a train, like once it's on the tracks, it keeps on going. But also the group of people who are experiencing injustice don't have enough power to really influence influence behavior of other people too. And that's very different than us today.
Right. No, I think it's definitely a great point. So I know we've been about an hour or so, and I want us to wrap up. There's been a great discussion, though, and obviously just kind of scratched the surface. Are there any other kind of last points about Buffy or apocalypticism that you want to make sure we touch on?
Hey, you know what? The only thing I'll say is it's just a week or two after Halloween, about not even that long, less than a week after Halloween, and I had a Buffy episode on as I was receiving trick-or-treaters, and some teenagers came to my door, and they kind of looked up at the scene, and they said, "What? Oh, what? You have some movie on in the background." I said, "That's not a movie. That's Buffy." And it's not just a TV show, it's a lifestyle. And so I'll leave with that and encourage, any other questions that people have, please send them my way. It'd be fun to engage with those.
Cool. Well, thank you. Yeah. Why don't you spend a minute? I know you do some really interesting projects and sort of you have a kind of pretty strong social media presence. You want to say a bit about some of the stuff you're doing and how people can follow you and your work?
Sure. I think probably the easiest way is just go to my website, which is katyvalentine.com. And from there, I have different things that I'm doing.
And that's Katy.
Ty, thank you. Yes, it's Katy Valentine, just like the holiday, VALENTINE.com. And from there, you can see different projects that I'm working on. I have a recent CD that's out for those that are into like harp music. It's one of the things I do. My scholarship, I have a book coming out pretty soon. I'll post that on the website. Some different articles. I work a lot with gender and identity in the ancient world and a little bit with pop culture too. And from there, you can find me on Facebook and all the other stuff, or you can ask Matthew and he can tell you as well.
Great. And I'll include some links to that in the show notes. And again, I'm Matthew. This is the Superhero Ethics Podcast. You can find us at superheroethics.com or by searching for Superhero Ethics on iTunes. You can also find us on Twitter or on Facebook, both just under that name, Superhero Ethics. And please engage with us. I know, as Katy said, we'd both love to hear other people's thoughts. Where do you guys see apocalypticism in some of these movies or TV show? Or what are some of the interesting, like either good or bad ways you see it playing out and the way choices characters make? Let us know. Post a comment on Facebook. Send us an email at superheroethics@gmail.com. Send us something on Twitter. I think for myself and for Katy, and I know also for Paul, we do this because we love these conversations. We'd love to continue them. So, Katy, thank you again for being a guest. This was a lot of fun. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's great. Well, I'll get you back on again soon. Take care, everyone. Have a good day.